I am Claire, 33 years old, and after my husband threw me out into the pouring rain without a single cent, I thought my life was completely over. When I tried to use an old card my father had left me, the bank manager turned pale, slung open his door, and shouted for everyone to move aside. I was in complete shock when I discovered that my late father had secretly left me an empire, and my ex-husband had unknowingly borrowed millions from a firm I now owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. It was a Tuesday evening, and the rain in our suburban Connecticut neighborhood was coming down in relentless sheets. Cold water soaked straight through my coat, clinging to my skin as I walked up the paved walkway of the house I had called home for 4 years. I was utterly exhausted. As a UX researcher for an educational technology company, I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift analyzing user data, desperately trying to keep my head above water at work while my personal life crumbled. All I wanted was to step inside, take a hot shower, and crash onto the couch. I reached out my shivering hand and typed my usual 6-digit PIN into the sleek smart lock on the front door. The keypad chimed 3 times with a sharp, harsh red flash. Access denied. I frowned, thinking my fingers were just too wet, so I wiped the glass screen with my sleeve and carefully punched in the numbers again. Access denied. The lock buzzed mechanically, rejecting me a second time. My heart did a sudden, uncomfortable flip in my chest. Before I could even pull my phone out to check if the electronic system was glitching, the heavy oak door swung open from the inside. Standing in the warm, golden glow of the foyer was my 35-year-old husband, Harrison. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy sweater and slacks, holding a glass of scotch in his right hand. But he was not alone. Flanking him on his left, wearing an oversized silk robe that I recognized instantly because it belonged to me, was Kendall. At 28, Kendall was a commercial real estate broker, a woman Harrison had introduced to me 6 months ago as a prospective client for his venture capital firm. Harrison did not smile, nor did he look surprised to see me shivering under the dark sky. He simply took a slow sip of his drink and looked down at me as if I were a stray dog on his porch. I stood there, water dripping from my hair onto my face, my eyes darting from his cold face to Kendall, who was leaning casually against the doorframe with a smug, victorious smirk. "What is going on, Harrison?" I asked, my voice trembling from the freezing cold and a sudden wave of nausea. "Why is my code not working, and why is Kendall wearing my robe?" Harrison did not answer me right away. Instead, he casually pointed his glass toward the manicured front lawn. I turned my head following his gesture and felt my breath catch in my throat. Sitting right there in the muddy grass, completely exposed to the torrential downpour, were 3 large black garbage bags. One of them had ripped open at the seam, and I could see my clothes, my books, and the framed photograph of my late father soaking in the mud. Harrison stepped forward onto the covered porch, pulling a thick stack of papers from his back pocket. Without a word of explanation, he tossed the documents directly at my feet. The pages scattered across the wet concrete, instantly getting soaked. "Pack your things and get off my property," Harrison said, his voice flat, devoid of a single drop of emotion. "We are done, Claire. Those are your divorce papers." I stared at the papers on the ground, then looked up at him in sheer disbelief. "Are you insane?" I yelled over the sound of the falling rain. "You cannot just throw me out of my own house. We bought this place together. I paid for half of the down payment with my savings. My name is on the mortgage." Harrison let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the sound of the thunder. "Your name?" he sneered, taking a step closer to the edge of the porch, while Kendall crossed her arms, watching the spectacle with delight. "Do not make me laugh, Claire. You contribute a pathetic UX researcher salary. You make peanuts compared to what it takes to maintain a lifestyle in this zip code. You think your little contribution gives you rights here." He leaned in, his eyes narrowing with pure malice. "Let me educate you on how the real world works. 3 months ago, I restructured the ownership. I leveraged this house as collateral against a credit line for my firm. I own the debt, which means I own the equity. You have no standing here. You are a financial ghost in this house, Claire. You brought nothing into this marriage, and you are leaving with nothing." The sheer arrogance in his voice made my blood boil. For 3 years, I had watched him play high-stakes games with other people's money, but I never imagined he would use his corporate maneuvers to strip me of my own home. I looked at Kendall, who let out a soft giggle, adjusting the belt of my robe. "He is right, Claire," Kendall added, her tone dripping with condescension. "Harrison needs a real partner, someone who understands high finance and real estate, not a glorified paper pusher who cries every time work gets stressful. You should really just take your bags and leave before you embarrass yourself any further." Something inside me snapped. The years of suppressing my anger of trying to be the supportive, quiet wife while Harrison chased his corporate ambitions evaporated in an instant. I stepped up onto the porch intending to push past him to grab my purse, my keys, and demand to speak to a lawyer right from the kitchen phone. "I am not going anywhere," I said firmly, my voice shaking with rage as I tried to step around Harrison. "This is my legal residence, and you cannot lock me out without a court order." Harrison did not even bother to block my path with his body. He simply raised his arm, pointed his finger toward the street, and smirked. "Go ahead, try it," he said calmly. Just then, bright red and blue lights illuminated the rain-drenched street. The low rumble of an engine filled the air as two police cruisers pulled up along the curb, their emergency lights flashing against the wet trees. I froze on the porch steps, staring at the flashing lights in utter confusion. Harrison took a slow sip of his scotch and smiled a cold, calculated look that chilled me more than the freezing rain. "I called the precinct 20 minutes ago," Harrison whispered, leaning down so only I could hear him over the storm. "I told them a disgruntled, unstable former employee was trying to break into my private residence and harass my fiancé. If you take one more step toward this door, Claire, I will have them arrest you for hostile trespassing. Let us see how your little tech job handles a mugshot on your record." The heavy boots of the two police officers sloshed against the wet pavement as they approached the porch. One officer rested his hand casually on his utility belt, while the other stepped between Harrison and me. They did not look at the garbage bags on the lawn or my soaking wet clothes. They only looked at Harrison, who instantly transformed his demeanor from a mocking predator to a concerned, exhausted homeowner. "Officer, thank you for arriving so quickly," Harrison said smoothly. His voice was practically dripping with manufactured relief. "My ex-wife is having a difficult time accepting the separation boundaries. I just need her escorted off the premises so my fiancé and I can have a peaceful evening." I tried to speak, but the cold rain and the sheer shock of his lies made my jaw tremble. "I live here," I managed to say, pointing a shaking finger at the front door. "My name is on the mortgage. He literally locked me out 20 minutes ago." The older officer turned to me, his expression entirely neutral. "Ma'am, if there is a domestic dispute over property ownership, that is a civil matter for the family courts. Right now, the resident inside has asked you to leave. If you refuse, we will have to detain you for trespassing and disturbing the peace." I looked at the officers, then back at Harrison. Kendall was peeking out from behind his shoulder, holding a manicured hand over her mouth to hide her grin. The police were not going to help me. The law in this exact moment was firmly on the side of the man standing inside the warm, dry house. I swallowed the bitter lump in my throat, nodded silently, and stepped backward off the porch. I walked into the muddy grass and grabbed the torn plastic garbage bags. The officers watched me drag my ruined belongings down the driveway and out of the neighborhood cul-de-sac. I hauled the heavy soaking bags for 3 blocks until I reached a small, dimly lit bus stop shelter. The plastic awning barely kept the wind out, but it offered a temporary shield from the torrential downpour. I dropped the bags onto the concrete and leaned against the cold glass of the shelter. My teeth chattered violently. I needed to get out of the cold. I needed a hot shower and a bed, and then I would hire the most aggressive divorce attorney in the state first thing in the morning. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. The screen was smeared with rain, but I managed to open my banking app. Harrison and I shared a joint savings account. We had been pooling our money for years, ostensibly for a larger property or an emergency fund. I knew exactly how much was in there: $62,000. I planned to transfer $5,000 to my personal checking account to cover a decent hotel for the week and a retainer for a lawyer. The app loaded. The screen flashed white, then blue, displaying my dashboard. I blinked, wiping the rainwater from my eyes, sure that the screen was glitching due to the storm. Available balance, $0.00. My heart slammed against my ribs. I frantically tapped on the transaction history. The ledger loaded, showing a single massive transfer executed exactly 4 hours ago. Harrison had authorized a wire transfer of the entire $62,000 into a private external account. A wave of pure panic washed over me. I checked my personal checking account. It showed a balance of $14 because my paycheck was directly deposited into our joint account. I had virtually no cash to my name. I felt the air leave my lungs as the brutal reality of state financial law crashed down on me. In our state, any individual named on a joint bank account has the legal right to withdraw the entire balance without the consent or knowledge of the other party. It was a vicious, completely legal maneuver, and Harrison had timed it perfectly. He had wiped out my entire life savings just hours before serving me the divorce papers. My phone buzzed in my freezing hand, startling me. A new text message appeared on the screen. It was an unknown number, but the attached image loaded instantly. It was a photograph of Kendall's hand resting on the steering wheel of Harrison's luxury SUV. On her ring finger sat a massive, ostentatiously large diamond ring. It caught the light perfectly sparkling with a price tag that made my stomach churn. Below the image was a text, "Harrison's startup money finally bought me the life I deserve. Have a nice night in the rain, sweetie." Startup money. Harrison had not used his firm's capital. He had taken my savings, the money I had earned, working endless 12-hour shifts, analyzing data to buy his mistress a diamond ring. He had stolen my past to fund her future. I shoved the phone into my pocket, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a response. I dragged my garbage bags to where I had parked my car earlier that morning. My 10-year-old Honda Civic sat under a street lamp, looking battered and incredibly small against the backdrop of the wealthy neighborhood. I shoved the bags into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands shook violently as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered before roaring to life. I turned the heater on full blast, but it only blew lukewarm air. I put the car in drive and headed toward the highway, searching for the cheapest roadside motel I could find. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the flickering neon parking lot of a budget motel. The lobby smelled heavily of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. I stood at the front desk, leaving puddles of rainwater on the linoleum floor, and pulled out my primary credit card. "I need a room for the night," I told the night clerk, pushing my wet hair out of my face. He took the card, ran it through the machine, and frowned. The machine beeped aggressively. "Declined," he said in a bored tone, handing the card back. "That is impossible," I replied, my voice rising in panic. "Try it again, please." He swiped it a second time. The same harsh beep echoed in the quiet lobby. "Declined again, ma'am. Do you have another card or cash?" I fumbled through my wallet, pulling out my secondary credit card. He swiped it. Declined. I pulled out a third card, a backup I kept for emergencies. Declined. I stepped away from the counter, my face burning with humiliation, and dialed the customer service number on the back of the primary card. An automated voice answered cheerfully, informing me that my account had been closed by the primary account holder. Harrison was the primary account holder on all our credit lines. I was only an authorized user. He had called the credit card companies and canceled every single one of my supplementary cards. He had meticulously cut off every avenue of financial survival, trapping me in an invisible cage of poverty. I walked out of the motel lobby, the harsh neon lights reflecting in the puddles around my worn-out shoes. I got back into my Civic and sat behind the steering wheel. I had $14 to my name. I had no access to credit. I had no savings. I reached into the back seat, pulling a damp sweater from one of the ripped garbage bags and wrapped it around my shivering shoulders. I reclined the driver's seat as far back as it would go. The rain continued to hammer against the windshield, sounding like a steady drumbeat of defeat. I curled into a tight ball in the freezing cabin of my 10-year-old sedan. The cold seeped into my bones, but the physical chill was nothing compared to the absolute terrifying realization that the man I had loved for years had meticulously engineered my total destruction. I woke up the next morning to the harsh glare of the early sun piercing through the rain-streaked windshield of my Honda Civic. Every muscle in my body ached, locked in a stiff, unnatural position from sleeping curled around the steering wheel. The air inside the cabin was freezing thick with the damp condensation of my own breath. I sat up slowly, my head pounding with a dull, relentless ache that radiated down my neck. I had survived the night, but survival was not going to pay for a lawyer, a hot meal, or a hotel room. I needed to go to work. I needed to log into the corporate server, keep my job, and figure out a strategic plan to fight back. But my primary work laptop, my expensive secure machine issued by the company, was currently sitting in a garbage bag on the front lawn of the house I used to own, ruined by the storm. Then I remembered a small sliver of luck. Last Sunday, I had visited Harrison's younger sister, Stella, to help her set up a new smart home security system. I had brought my backup work laptop with me and absent-mindedly left it on her kitchen island. It was my only lifeline to my job, my only remaining connection to a stable paycheck. I forced my numb fingers to turn the ignition key. The engine coughed twice before sputtering to life, the heater still blowing useless, lukewarm air. I pulled out of the dingy motel parking lot and navigated the heavy morning traffic toward the affluent gated community where Stella lived. At 30 years old, Stella had always mirrored her brother's profound arrogance. She lived in a sprawling, modern farmhouse funded entirely by her husband, Jamal. Jamal was a 32-year-old independent auditor, a brilliant and quiet African-American man who always seemed entirely out of place among Harrison's loud, boastful, and incredibly toxic family. Jamal was the only one who ever treated me with genuine respect, often offering a sympathetic smile when Stella made her cutting remarks at holiday dinners. I parked my battered sedan at the end of Stella's pristine paver stone driveway. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My hair was damp and tangled, my eyes bloodshot, and my clothes deeply wrinkled from sleeping in them. I looked exactly like the broken woman Harrison wanted me to be. I took a deep breath, gathered whatever shred of dignity I had left, and walked up to the heavy mahogany front door. I rang the doorbell twice, waiting in the crisp morning air. The door swung open. Stella stood there in expensive designer yoga pants, holding a steaming mug of artisanal coffee. She did not look surprised to see my disheveled, freezing state. In fact, a cruel, knowing smile spread across her perfectly made-up face. Harrison had clearly already called her to gloat about the lockout. "I am just here for my backup laptop," I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible, refusing to let her see me shiver. "I left it on your kitchen counter last week. I need it for work. Please just hand it to me and I will leave your property." Stella took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, leaning her shoulder against the doorframe to physically block the entrance. Her eyes raked over my rumpled clothes and muddy shoes with absolute disgust. "You really have no shame, Claire," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Showing up here looking like a homeless person. Harrison told me you caused a massive scene last night in front of the neighbors. Honestly, you should be entirely embarrassed by your behavior." I stared at her, my hands balling into tight fists at my sides. "He locked me out of my own house and stole my entire life savings, Stella. He committed financial abuse." "Oh, please." Stella laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the quiet suburban street. "He took back what rightfully belonged to him. You were just a placeholder, Claire. A boring, low-earning placeholder. Harrison is building an empire. He needs a woman who matches his ambition, not a pathetic researcher who cannot even give him children." The comment about my infertility felt like a physical strike to the chest, stealing the air from my lungs. Stella knew exactly how many grueling, painful medical treatments I had endured trying to build a family with her brother. She knew how thoroughly the clinical failures had broken my heart, yet she wielded that trauma like a weapon. "Kendall is a powerhouse," Stella continued, clearly relishing the pain flashing across my face. "She just closed a $5 million commercial real estate deal yesterday. $5 million, Claire. That is what a real partner looks like. She is a winner. You are just dead weight holding my brother back." My vision blurred with a volatile mix of exhaustion and absolute fury. "Dead weight," I repeated, my voice rising above a whisper. "I spent my entire 20s carrying this family. When your mother got sick with early onset dementia, where were you? You were backpacking through Europe on Harrison's dime. Where was Harrison? He was working late to build his so-called empire. I was the one changing her clothes. I was the one managing her complex medications, taking her to every single doctor's appointment, and holding her hand while she forgot her own name. I sacrificed my youth, my career growth, and my peace of mind to care for your mother while you all looked the other way." Stella rolled her eyes, completely unmoved by the undeniable truth. "That was your basic duty as a wife," she scoffed. "You lived under our family's roof. You ate our food. You enjoyed the luxurious lifestyle my brother provided. Caring for our mother was the bare minimum you could do to pay your rent. Harrison owes you absolutely nothing for that. In fact, you owe him for putting up with your mediocrity for this long." I stood frozen on the pristine welcome mat. The sheer rewrite of history, the utter lack of humanity in her words left me entirely speechless. They had eagerly consumed my time, my savings, and my youth, and now they were brazenly rewriting the narrative to make me the villain. There was no point in arguing with someone who viewed basic human compassion as a financial transaction. "Just give me my laptop," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, flat tone. "I am not leaving this porch without it." "You can buy a new one with your non-existent savings," Stella spat. "Have a terrible life, Claire." She grabbed the heavy brass handle and moved to violently slam the mahogany door right in my face. But before the heavy wood could click into the frame, a large, strong hand reached out from the shadows of the foyer and caught the edge of the door, stopping it dead with a loud thud. Stella gasped and stepped back in shock. Jamal stepped into the doorway, moving completely in front of his wife. He was already dressed in a sharp gray suit for his accounting firm, but his tie was loosened and his face was unusually pale. Jamal looked down at me and I immediately saw it in his eyes. He was not looking at me with the usual quiet pity he displayed at family dinners. He was looking at me with intense, unspoken anxiety. Jamal stepped firmly past his wife, ignoring her loud gasp of indignation. "What on earth are you doing?" Stella shrieked, reaching out to grab the sleeve of his tailored suit jacket. Jamal did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked on mine, his expression a tight mask of absolute urgency. In his left hand, he held my black nylon laptop bag. He extended it toward me. I reached out with trembling fingers to take the handle. As my skin brushed against his, I felt something else. Jamal flipped his wrist slightly, pressing a tightly wadded, crumpled piece of paper directly into the center of my palm. He squeezed my hand shut around it, a silent but desperate command to keep it hidden from his wife. Stella grabbed his shoulder, her sharp manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric of his suit. "Get away from her, Jamal!" she yelled, her face twisting with ugly rage. "I told her to get off our property." Jamal allowed his wife to pull him backward, but as he retreated into the foyer, he leaned forward just an inch. "He did not just take the house," Jamal whispered rapidly, his deep voice barely carrying over the sound of the morning wind. "Look at the corporate filings from last month." Before I could even process his words or ask a single question, Stella aggressively yanked him back inside. She grabbed the heavy brass handle and slammed the mahogany door shut with a deafening crack. The deadbolt slid into place with a sharp, heavy click, locking me out once again. I stood on the porch for a long moment, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I looked down at my closed fist. My knuckles were entirely white. Whatever Jamal had just given me, it was dangerous enough that he had to sneak it past his own wife. I turned around and sprinted down the paver stone driveway, desperate to get back to the isolated safety of my car. I threw the heavy laptop bag onto the passenger seat of my 10-year-old Honda Civic and slammed the driver's side door shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely peel my fingers open. I placed the crumpled ball of paper on the steering wheel and began to carefully smooth out the deep creases. The paper was slightly damp from my sweaty palm, but the black ink was perfectly legible. It was a printed spreadsheet, heavily cropped and clearly printed in a rush from a secure accounting database. At the very top, the header read, "Commercial Debt Obligation and Collateral Summary." I scanned the columns, my eyes darting across the rows of complex financial jargon until they locked onto a specific string of numbers. It was the exact address of the suburban home I had bought with Harrison. I traced my finger across the row. The document outlined a massive high-interest business loan issued exactly 30 days ago. The borrower was Harrison's venture capital firm. The collateral securing the debt was my primary residence, and the total loan amount was a staggering $2 million. The air vanished from the small cabin of my car. A cold, suffocating panic gripped my chest. $2 million. Harrison had not just restructured the ownership of our home to kick me out. He had secretly leveraged the entire property to secure an enormous injection of cash for his failing startup. But that was legally impossible. My name was still on the original deed and the mortgage. No legitimate bank would ever approve a collateral lien of that magnitude without the explicit notarized signature of both homeowners unless he forged it. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The smug look on Harrison's face the night before suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. He had drained our joint savings to fund his immediate lifestyle, but the real money, the millions he needed to keep his arrogant facade alive, was tied directly to this fraudulent loan. If his venture capital firm defaulted on those payments, the bank would immediately seize the house. He had literally gambled my only asset on his own reckless ego. Jamal was an auditor. He had access to the raw financial data of Harrison's firm, and he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy my ex-husband. If I could get to the local bank branch and contest the lien, if I could prove to the loan officers that I never signed the collateral agreement, the bank would instantly freeze Harrison's accounts pending a federal fraud investigation. I shoved the crumpled paper deep into the front pocket of my damp jeans. I jammed the key into the ignition and forced the struggling engine to start. I pulled out of the affluent neighborhood and sped toward the commercial district, navigating the heavy morning traffic with a singular burning focus. I was going to burn his empire to the ground. I did not care that my clothes were damp and wrinkled. I did not care that I looked like a vagrant. I was going to walk into that bank and blow the whistle on a $2 million fraud. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the paved parking lot of a high-end commercial bank branch. I gripped the steering wheel, taking a deep breath to steady my racing pulse. I had to be smart about this. Harrison was charming, well-connected, and entirely ruthless. He had likely anticipated I would discover the loan eventually, but he vastly underestimated my endurance. I walked for over an hour, my breathing turning into heavy gasps by the time the sprawling glass and steel facade of the commercial bank finally came into view. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors, immediately bringing a thick trail of muddy water onto the pristine marble floor of the lobby. The aggressive air conditioning blasted against my soaked clothes, making my teeth chatter violently. The bank was mostly empty at this hour, save for a few wealthy clients sipping complimentary espresso on plush leather couches. They all turned to stare at me with undisguised disgust. I ignored them completely. I marched straight past the velvet security ropes and approached the desk of a junior teller. She was a young woman with a perfectly structured blowout and a highly condescending smile, typing leisurely on a mechanical keyboard. I did not wait for her to greet me. I dropped my heavy laptop bag onto the floor and slapped the damp, crumpled commercial loan statement directly onto her immaculate glass counter. I need to pull the complete transaction history on this property immediately. I demanded, my voice hoarse but entirely steady. My name is Claire, and I am the primary co-owner of the residential collateral listed on that sheet. The signature authorizing this $2 million loan is a complete forgery. I need you to freeze the dispersal accounts and escalate this to your fraud department right now. The junior teller blinked clearly, taken aback by my authoritative tone. She leaned back in her plush ergonomic chair, her eyes scanning my dripping hair, my wrinkled clothes, and the growing puddle of dirty rainwater forming around my ruined shoes. Her condescending smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer unprofessional disdain. She used a single manicured fingernail to slide the damp paper closer to her keyboard. "Ma'am," she said, dragging out the word with deliberate slowness, "you cannot just walk in here off the street and demand we freeze corporate accounts. Let me see your identification." I pulled my damp driver's license from my wallet and handed it to her. She snatched it from my fingers, typed my information into her terminal, and stared at the glowing monitor. A moment later, she let out a sharp, mocking sigh. "Well, Claire," she said, emphasizing my first name with deep disrespect, "I cannot pull any transaction history for you because you do not have authorization on this specific corporate account. And frankly, looking at your personal financial profile, I am amazed you even have the nerve to walk into this branch today." "What are you talking about?" I snapped, gripping the edge of the glass counter to steady my shaking hands. "My name is on the original deed to that house. Your name is also on 7 heavily defaulted credit lines," she shot back, turning her monitor slightly so I could see the glaring red alerts covering my profile. "Your credit score is practically non-existent. It is currently sitting at an abysmal 410. You have maxed out credit cards, multiple shadow accounts in severe delinquency, and a vehicle repossession order that officially executed this morning. You are a massive financial liability. We would not even approve you for a $50 overdraft, let alone grant you access to a multi-million-dollar corporate ledger." I stared at the screen, my heart dropping entirely into my stomach. Harrison had not just canceled my supplementary cards. Over the last 2 years, he had secretly opened multiple shadow credit cards using my social security number. He had maxed them out to silently fund his lavish lifestyle and deliberately let them default, utterly destroying my financial identity without my knowledge. He had built a flawless, invisible cage around me. "You do not understand," I pleaded, desperation finally creeping into my voice. "Those accounts are entirely fraudulent. My ex-husband opened them without my consent. You have to look at the collateral agreement on that commercial loan. He forged my signature to leverage my house. If you do not flag this right now, he is going to embezzle those funds." The teller rolled her eyes, completely losing her patience with me. She grabbed my damp driver's license and tossed it carelessly back across the counter. It slid off the slick glass and landed on the wet floor. "I understand perfectly," she sneered. "You are a delinquent debtor trying to blame your ex-husband for your own terrible financial choices. I am not going to entertain this ridiculous conspiracy theory, and I am certainly not going to let you drip mud all over my station any longer." She reached out and firmly pressed a red button on her desk phone. "Security, we need assistance at Station 4, she announced over the intercom. "We have a loitering vagrant who is refusing to leave the premises. Please escort her out immediately." I stood frozen, the heavy weight of absolute defeat crashing down on me. I had nothing left. No money, no car, no home, and now, no identity. 2 large security guards in dark suits began walking briskly toward me from the front entrance. I bent down to pick up my driver's license from the dirty floor. As my fingers brushed against my leather wallet, they grazed a small hidden zipper compartment tucked deep inside the billfold. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped moving entirely. 5 years ago, just days before he passed away from a sudden heart attack, my father Thomas had handed me a small sealed envelope. He told me to put it in my wallet and never open it unless I had absolutely nowhere else to turn. I had completely forgotten it existed until this exact moment. The security guards were 10 feet away. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the counter and come with us," the taller guard ordered, reaching out to grab my arm. I ignored him. My fingers dug into the hidden zipper. I ripped it open and pulled out the contents. It was not a piece of paper or a check. It was a solid, heavy matte black metal card. It had no bank logo, no phone number, and no visible account details. The only marking was a faint, deeply embossed silver insignia in the center and a thick magnetic strip on the back. I stood up straight, brushing the guard's hand away with a sudden, icy confidence. I looked the junior teller dead in the eye and slammed the heavy black metal card onto the glass counter. The thick metal hit the glass with a loud, authoritative crack that echoed across the entire silent bank floor. "Run the card," I commanded. The junior teller stared at the heavy piece of metal resting on her pristine glass counter. She blinked slowly, entirely unfazed by my sudden burst of authority. Instead of picking it up to swipe it through her terminal, she let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. She picked up the black card using only her thumb and index finger, holding it up to the fluorescent lights as if it were a dirty, disease-ridden napkin. "What exactly is this supposed to be?" she asked, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "There is no microchip. There is no bank logo. The magnetic strip on the back is completely worn down. Are you trying to hand me a novelty gift card, Claire? Do you really think a fake piece of metal is going to suddenly wipe away your massive debt and fix your pathetic credit score?" The two security guards had now reached my side. The taller one clamped his heavy hand down on my left shoulder, his grip tightening painfully through my soaked coat. "That is enough of a scene for today, ma'am," the guard said gruffly. "You are coming with us right now. We can do this the easy way, or we can call the local police to handle your trespassing charge." I tried to jerk my shoulder away, but his grip was like a vice. I kept my eyes locked on the teller, refusing to let her see my fear. I said, "Run the card." The teller ignored me completely, aligning the sharp metal blades over the faint silver insignia, applying intense pressure to snap the metal. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden doors of the executive offices swung open. Mr. Mitchell, the 50-year-old stoic branch manager, stepped out onto the lobby floor. He was a man who exuded quiet, absolute power, dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, holding a leather-bound tablet. He was deep in conversation with a wealthy local real estate developer, guiding him toward the main exit. As Mitchell walked past the teller station, the overhead fluorescent lights caught the metallic surface of the black card, just as the teller prepared to destroy it. The faint, deeply embossed silver insignia flashed brightly in the light. Mitchell stopped dead in his tracks. He did not just pause. His entire body physically froze as if someone had injected ice water directly into his veins. The expensive leather-bound tablet slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor with a loud, echoing smack. The wealthy developer beside him frowned, asking if he was all right, but Mitchell did not even hear him. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly ash color. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. "What on earth are you doing?" Mitchell roared, his deep voice shattering the quiet atmosphere of the entire bank. He lunged forward with a speed that entirely defied his age. He reached across the glass counter and violently slapped the stainless steel scissors right out of the junior teller's hand. The heavy scissors flew through the air and crashed against the back wall, narrowly missing an expensive glass partition. The teller shrieked, jumping back in her ergonomic chair. "Mr. Mitchell," she stammered, her face flushed with extreme shock and confusion. "I was just confiscating a fake card from this vagrant. She is severely delinquent and she is causing a massive disturbance on the floor." Mitchell did not even look at her. He leaned over the counter, staring at the black metal card as if it were a live explosive. He carefully picked it up by the edges, his hands shaking so violently the metal rattled against the glass surface. He brought it inches from his face, tracing the faint silver insignia with a trembling thumb. He spun around to face the teller, his eyes blazing with a fury so intense it made the young woman shrink back into her chair. "Ma'am, quickly look at this," Mitchell shouted, his voice cracking with absolute panic as he shoved the card toward her face. "Do you have any idea what you just tried to destroy? Do you have any concept of whose insignia this is?" The teller shook her head, tears of humiliation welling up in her eyes. "I just assumed it was a novelty card, sir. Her credit score is in the 400s. Mitchell slammed his fist against the desk, silencing her instantly. "You are fired," he stated, his voice dropping to a deadly absolute whisper. "Pack up your personal belongings immediately. You are permanently terminated from this institution, and I will personally ensure you never work in the financial sector again. Now get out of my sight." The teller burst into loud sobs, grabbing her purse and sprinting away from the desk in pure shame. The two security guards instantly let go of my arms, taking several nervous steps backward. The entire bank floor had fallen completely silent. The wealthy clients on the plush leather couches stopped drinking their espresso, staring at the scene in absolute shock. Mitchell took a deep, shuddering breath, trying desperately to regain his professional composure. He turned to me. The absolute power and authority he had just displayed vanished, instantly replaced by a posture of deep, undeniable reverence. He adjusted his suit jacket, stepped around the glass counter, and bowed his head slightly toward me. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for the inexcusable behavior of my former staff," Mitchell said, his voice trembling with deep respect. "We had no idea you were coming today. Please forgive this catastrophic breach of protocol." I stood there, still dripping wet from the rain, my ruined shoes pooling muddy water on the expensive marble floor. I was utterly bewildered. 5 minutes ago, I was a loitering vagrant about to be thrown into the freezing street. Now the most powerful man in the building was bowing to me. "Do you know what this card is?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell nodded slowly, holding the heavy black metal with the utmost care. "I do, ma'am. I have worked in upper-tier banking for 30 years, and I have only ever seen one of these in person. It is a master ledger key. The security protocols for this account supersede every single rule in this branch." He gestured toward the back of the lobby with an open, inviting hand. "Please come with me," he urged softly. "We cannot discuss this on the public floor." He did not ask for my identification. He did not ask for my signature or mention my ruined credit score. He completely bypassed every security protocol, leading me past the velvet ropes and the staring clients. We walked down a long, quiet corridor lined with expensive artwork until we reached a set of heavy steel elevator doors. Mitchell pulled a physical key from his pocket, inserted it into a hidden panel on the wall, and turned it. The doors slid open, revealing a private elevator car lined with dark mahogany and brushed steel. I stepped inside, clutching my damp laptop bag tightly to my chest. Mitchell followed me, pressing a single button marked with a negative symbol. We were not going to the executive suites on the upper floors. We were descending deep underground, heading straight down into the subterranean VIP vault. The elevator descended in absolute silence, the gentle hum of the mechanics, the only sound in the small mahogany cabin. When the doors finally slid open, I stepped out into a sprawling subterranean room made entirely of polished concrete and reinforced glass. There were no teller windows here, only a massive central console surrounded by heavy steel monitors. Mitchell walked briskly to the console and gestured for me to sit in a plush leather chair. He took the black metal card from his pocket with extreme care and slid it into a specialized biometric scanner. The heavy steel monitors instantly flashed a brilliant emerald green. A complex web of financial data flooded the screens, scrolling faster than my eyes could follow. Mitchell turned to me, his posture stiff and formal, addressing me with absolute reverence. "Welcome back, Ms. Clare," he said softly. "The trust has been awaiting your arrival for 5 years." I shook my head in utter confusion, shivering slightly in my damp clothes. "Trust," I repeated. My father was a quiet, middle-class hardware supplier. He ran a small shop in Fairfield. He did not have a trust. Mitchell offered a gentle, knowing smile. Thomas was a brilliant man who valued his privacy above all else. The hardware store was merely a quiet hobby, a front to keep his family shielded from the vicious nature of his true work. Your father was the silent architect of one of the most ruthless corporate debt acquisition firms on the East Coast. He engineered hostile takeovers, bought distressed assets, and liquidated failing companies. He hid his true wealth behind a meticulously structured blind trust to protect you from the dangerous people he dealt with. Mitchell tapped the glass screen, bringing up a centralized dashboard. The numbers on the screen were so large they looked completely unreal. The trust contains over $80 million in liquid assets, along with a massive portfolio of commercial real estate, Mitchell explained, pointing to the glowing figures. Because it is an irrevocable blind trust established long before your marriage, every single penny is legally shielded from any marital property claims. Your husband has zero claim to this money. I sat absolutely frozen in the plush leather chair. $80 million. Hours ago, I had only $14 to my name and was forced to sleep in my freezing car. Now I easily possessed more wealth than Harrison and Kendall combined. But the shock of the inheritance was nothing compared to what Mitchell showed me next. He pulled up a specific subsidiary ledger, his expression turning grim. "Ms. Clare, I need you to look at this," he said, enlarging a document on the center monitor. I traced the digital ledger with my index finger, completely unable to breathe. One of the subsidiary corporate lenders owned entirely by my father's secret trust was the exact same firm that had quietly issued Harrison's fraudulent $2 million business loan against my residential property. I stared at the glowing green text on the monitor, the reality of the situation slowly washing over me. Harrison had not outsmarted me. He had unwittingly walked straight into a trap my father had built years ago. I did not just have the money to fight him. I literally owned the debt that was keeping his entire venture capital firm afloat. If I called in that loan, his entire fabricated world would collapse overnight. Before I could fully process the immense power I now held, Mitchell picked up a secure phone on this console and pressed a single button. "We need counsel in the vault immediately," he said quietly. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy steel elevator doors slid open again. A woman walked in carrying a sleek leather briefcase. She was tall, in her mid-40s, with sharp features and an impeccably tailored suit that screamed absolute authority. Mitchell introduced her as Veronica, a razor-sharp corporate financial lawyer retained exclusively by the trust. I reached into my damp pocket, pulled out the crumpled commercial loan statement Jamal had secretly handed me on the porch, and placed it on the concrete table. Veronica did not ask any pointless questions about my ruined clothes or my muddy shoes. She simply opened her briefcase, pulled out a high-resolution scanner, and digitized the wrinkled paper. The document instantly appeared on the massive central monitor. Veronica typed a rapid sequence of commands, bypassing multiple banking firewalls to access the original digital loan application Harrison had submitted 30 days ago. She isolated the final page of the contract and zoomed in heavily on the collateral agreement. The screen displayed a high-definition scan of a notarized deed transfer. At the very bottom, next to Harrison's bold handwriting, was my own signature, or at least an incredibly desperate attempt at it. Veronica leaned closer to the screen, her eyes scanning the digital ink with predatory focus. "This is a complete fabrication," Veronica stated, her voice as cold as ice. "The pressure points on the pen strokes do not match your historical banking signatures. Harrison forged your name on this document and transmitted it across state lines to secure these funds. He has committed federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe bank fraud." Veronica turned to face me, closing her laptop with a sharp snap. "We can contact the federal authorities right now, Claire. With this undeniable evidence, agents will raid his office by noon, and he will be sitting in a federal holding cell by dinner." The option was deeply tempting. The thought of seeing Harrison in handcuffs today sent a thrill through my chest. But as I thought about him and Kendall laughing at me in the freezing rain, a darker realization took root in my mind. Sending him to prison today was entirely too quick. It was too merciful. I did not want him to just lose his freedom. I wanted him to lose absolutely everything he loved first. "Do not call the authorities yet," I told Veronica, leaning back in the plush leather chair with a new dangerous confidence. "Let him spend the stolen money. Let him inflate his arrogant lifestyle until he is completely trapped. We are going to tear his empire down piece by piece." Veronica smiled, a sharp, predatory grin that perfectly mirrored the new, dangerous energy surging through my veins. She closed the digital ledger on the massive central monitor and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the concrete table. She understood exactly what I wanted. We were not going to rely on the slow, bureaucratic wheels of the federal justice system to punish him. We were going to build a massive financial guillotine and let him eagerly pull the lever himself. Over the next 2 hours, sitting in the absolute security of that underground vault, Veronica and I mapped out a complete financial siege. I authorized her to deploy a fraction of the trust's massive liquid capital to execute a silent, aggressive acquisition strategy. I authorized Veronica to hire a specialized team of forensic accountants to track every single dollar Harrison moved. We discovered he was using a fragile web of bridge loans to fund his day-to-day operations. It was a pathetic, amateurish setup, using a complex network of anonymous corporate shell companies. Veronica began quietly hunting down every single outstanding line of credit tied to Harrison's venture capital firm and Kendall's commercial real estate business. We bought his equipment leases. We systematically bought out the lenders holding his bridge loans. We acquired the debt on the expensive servers powering his office, the lease on his imported espresso machines, and even the financing on the high-end artwork he hung in his lobby to impress potential clients. We even bought the secondary financing Kendall used to fund her expensive broker wardrobe. Within 48 hours, my holding companies legally owned every single financial obligation Harrison had to his name. I was his absolute master, yet he was completely oblivious, dancing wildly on a trapdoor I controlled. While I was quietly buying up the very foundation of his life, Harrison was busy celebrating what he wholeheartedly believed was his ultimate victory. Assuming I was still sleeping in my ruined 10-year-old sedan and begging for spare change outside budget motels, he shifted his arrogant spending into complete overdrive. Believing the forged $2 million loan provided an endless safety net, he immediately signed luxury leases on matching custom-ordered sports cars for himself and Kendall. He rented a massive, entirely unnecessary glass corner office in the most expensive commercial district in the city, signing a 10-year lease he could never actually afford, to stroke his own massive ego and project the image of a titan. Harrison began an aggressive, completely unsustainable hiring spree for his startup. He poached dozens of junior executives and analysts from competing firms, offering them exorbitant signing bonuses, despite having absolutely no long-term revenue streams to support payroll. He was aggressively bleeding cash every single day, entirely convinced his fraudulent financial maneuvering made him invincible. Kendall was equally intoxicated by the sudden influx of stolen wealth. A week later, I sat in the luxurious high-rise hotel suite Veronica had secured for me, wearing a plush robe that actually belonged to me, and opened my new smartphone. I clicked on a video Kendall had just proudly posted to her public social media feed. She was holding a glass of champagne, giving her thousands of followers a grand tour of the suburban home I had carefully decorated over the last 4 years. She strutted through the living room, explicitly mocking my taste in furniture before holding up her left hand to the camera. She flaunted the massive diamond ring Harrison had bought with my stolen life savings. Her voice was painfully shrill as she arrogantly announced they were hosting a massive high society engagement party at the house that coming weekend. She boasted about the exclusive guest list, noting that local tech investors, powerful politicians, and all of Harrison's wealthiest clients would be in attendance. She desperately wanted to prove to the world that they had firmly arrived at the absolute top of the social food chain. But her desperate need for public validation was their fatal, irreversible mistake. As she panned the camera around the newly landscaped backyard, the video documented tens of thousands of dollars in extravagant floral arrangements, top-tier catering deposits, and luxury party rentals already being delivered. She was openly bragging about the limitless budget for the event. Back in the trust headquarters, Veronica was actively monitoring their accounts in real time, because I now secretly owned all the secondary debt connected to those extravagant purchases, and because they were wildly spending capital secured by a commercial loan they were burning through at an alarming rate, their corporate liquidity ratios suddenly plummeted into the red zone. Their rapid, reckless spending tripped a critical financial covenant deeply embedded in the primary loan agreement. It was an automated tripwire we had purposefully left waiting for them, and Kendall had just gleefully sprinted right through it. The mechanism of a margin call in high-level corporate finance is incredibly unforgiving. When a borrower uses a heavily leveraged asset like my stolen house as collateral, the bank requires them to maintain a strict minimum amount of liquid cash on hand. If their spending causes that cash reserve to drop below the agreed threshold, the lender has the absolute legal right to demand an immediate massive cash deposit to balance the risk. Veronica called my secure phone from her office, her voice laced with deep satisfaction. She informed me that the automated system had officially generated the margin call notice. Harrison's firm was suddenly flagged as critically high risk. The banking servers instantly froze all of his outgoing capital. The credit cards he used to buy the matching sports cars were abruptly declined. The catering checks for his lavish engagement party bounced, and every single payroll transfer for his poached executives was halted. His firm's liquidity ratios, heavily accelerated by Kendall's reckless spending spree on luxury cars and party deposits, tripped a critical financial covenant. The bank's automated risk management software had flagged his account as critically unstable. The notice was entirely devoid of human empathy. It bluntly stated that Harrison had exactly 72 hours to produce a liquid cash deposit of $500,000. If he failed to wire the funds by the deadline, the bank would immediately declare the primary loan in default, seize all operational assets, and initiate immediate foreclosure on the residential collateral. Harrison stared at the glowing screen, his mouth slightly open. He blinked rapidly, entirely convinced this was a massive clerical error. He picked up his office phone and dialed his dedicated banking representative, ready to scream at them for the ridiculous glitch. The line rang twice before clicking over to a cold, automated voice system, informing him that his account had been temporarily frozen, pending a manual risk assessment. His heart began to hammer violently against his ribs. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He slammed the phone down so hard the plastic receiver cracked. He burst out of his glass office, his face entirely pale, his previous arrogance vanishing into thin air. He stormed into the open floor plan where the dozens of junior partners he had just poached were sitting at their desks. They looked up startled by his sudden manic energy. Harrison began screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that they drop everything they were doing and immediately secure emergency bridge loans to cover the liquidity gap. He ordered them to blast applications to every single secondary lender in the city. He paced frantically back and forth across the expensive hardwood floor, barking orders and threatening to fire anyone who could not secure a line of credit within the hour. What Harrison completely failed to realize was that Veronica had already constructed an invisible, impenetrable financial wall completely around him. Sitting in her own high-rise office on the other side of the city, Veronica watched her monitors with a predatory smile. Every time one of Harrison's junior partners submitted a credit application, it pinged against the network of anonymous shell companies I now controlled. Because my entities owned his secondary debt, we were able to instantly flag his firm as a massive credit risk across the entire banking sector. Within 20 minutes, the rejections began rolling in. Every single application was instantly and brutally denied. No bank, no private lender, and no credit union would lend Harrison a single dollar. He was completely financially quarantined. While Harrison was descending into absolute panic, I was experiencing a profound sense of liberation. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the educational technology company where I had worked for the last 4 years. I was no longer wearing the wrinkled, exhausted clothes of a defeated woman. I was dressed in a striking, custom-tailored designer suit purchased entirely with trust funds, my hair perfectly styled, my posture radiating absolute authority. I walked straight to my desk to collect a few personal items. Before I could even open a drawer, my dismissive boss marched over, holding a bright yellow disciplinary clipboard. He was a petty, arrogant man who had constantly belittled my work and denied my promotion requests. He slammed the clipboard down on my desk, his face red with anger. He loudly announced to the entire open office that, because I had missed 3 days of work without a doctor's note, he was officially writing me up for gross negligence and placing me on immediate unpaid probation. I did not flinch. I did not apologize. I slowly stood up, looking him dead in the eye. The sheer difference in our presence made him instinctively take a step back. I reached into my designer handbag, pulled out my plastic employee badge, and dropped it casually onto his disciplinary clipboard. I told him I was resigning effective immediately. Before he could even process the shock, I turned to the rest of the research team. I pulled out my new platinum corporate card and loudly announced that I was buying out the entire team's lunch from the most expensive 5-star steakhouse in the city to celebrate my departure. The office erupted in cheers. I left my boss standing there completely speechless, his petty authority completely shattered. I walked out of the building, the warm sun hitting my face, ready to fully step into my new reality as a corporate titan. Back at his failing startup, the 72-hour window was rapidly closing. Harrison was sitting on the floor of his corner office, his tie discarded, his expensive shirt soaked in sweat. His junior partners had all quietly left for the day, realizing the firm was a sinking ship. Kendall was texting him relentlessly, furiously, demanding to know why her luxury car lease had been suddenly declined at the dealership. The pressure was completely suffocating him. He was cornered. If he did not produce the $500,000 by morning, the bank would foreclose on the house, the engagement party would be publicly canceled, and his entire life would be exposed as a fraud. Desperation breeds terrible decisions. Harrison crawled back to his desk and pulled himself into his leather chair. He logged into the firm's highly secure master accounting portal. His eyes darted to the escrow accounts. These were heavily protected funds belonging entirely to his private investors, money legally earmarked for future acquisitions, and strictly forbidden from being used for operational expenses. It was the absolute golden rule of venture capital. Harrison's hand shook violently as he hovered his mouse over the transfer button. He told himself it was just a temporary fix. He told himself he would replace the money as soon as the margin call was satisfied and the primary loan was unlocked. He was completely delusional. He clicked the button authorizing a direct transfer of $500,000 from the protected investor escrow accounts directly into his primary liquidity pool. I took a deep breath, thinking he had just saved his empire. In reality, he had just committed the ultimate financial sin. He had crossed the line from basic bank forgery into massive, undeniable corporate embezzlement, sealing his own inescapable doom. Harrison's desperate crime did not go unnoticed. Across the city, Jamal was conducting his nightly review of the firm's overarching ledgers. As the lead independent auditor contracted by Harrison's venture capital firm, Jamal had direct access to the master banking logs. He was a meticulous man who noticed every single anomaly, no matter how small. When the massive $500,000 transfer suddenly populated on his dual monitors, his hands froze over his keyboard. He traced the routing numbers with horror. The funds had moved directly from the heavily guarded investor escrow accounts into the firm's primary operational liquidity pool. Jamal felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew the strict federal regulations governing venture capital better than anyone. Moving that money was a severe felony. He quickly ran a complex trace on the authorization signature and found Harrison's digital fingerprint stamped all over the transaction. Jamal understood immediately that the firm was collapsing, and Harrison was desperately looting the treasury to survive. He did not hesitate. He plugged a highly encrypted flash drive into his computer and began quietly downloading the raw audit logs, creating a permanent record of the corporate embezzlement. An hour later, Jamal stood in Veronica's glass-enclosed conference room. He clutched his leather briefcase tightly, sweating nervously. I walked in, flanked closely by Veronica. Jamal stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute shock. The last time he saw me, I was standing in the freezing rain, ruined and desperate on my former porch. Now I projected absolute, terrifying authority. I was wearing a charcoal designer suit, my posture radiating a newfound lethal confidence. I sat down at the head of the long marble table, crossing my legs elegantly, and gestured for him to take a seat. Jamal swallowed hard, opened his briefcase, and slid the encrypted flash drive across the cold marble. He explained exactly what he had found, his voice trembling slightly as he detailed Harrison's catastrophic financial crime. Veronica plugged the drive into her secure laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she bypassed the encryption. The raw audit logs illuminated the massive screen on the wall. The undeniable proof of Harrison crossing the point of no return was right in front of us. It was exactly the lethal ammunition we needed to finish him off. Veronica looked up from the glowing screen, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She turned to Jamal, her tone shifting to strict professional negotiation. As the auditor on record, she explained coldly, you are legally obligated to report this to the federal authorities. If you do not, you become an accessory to massive corporate fraud and face severe prison time yourself. Jamal visibly paled, sinking lower into his expensive chair. He stammered that he simply wanted to do the right thing, terrified of being dragged into Harrison's impending federal indictment. I raised my hand, silencing the room. I looked directly into Jamal's panicked eyes and offered him a way out. I promised him absolute legal immunity. Veronica would use her extensive connections to ensure his name was entirely scrubbed from the fallout. But I offered him much more than just a shield. I told him about the blind trust. I offered him a highly lucrative permanent position managing the $80 million portfolio as our lead financial controller, complete with a massive salary increase and full executive benefits. All he had to do in return was keep his mouth shut, return to the office, and provide us with real-time, unfiltered updates on every single desperate move Harrison made as his empire collapsed. Jamal did not even have to think about it. He shook my hand firmly, solidifying his role as our inside man. But the delicate web we were spinning hit a sudden, unexpected complication later that evening. Jamal returned to the upscale suburban home he shared with Stella, my former best friend who had so eagerly betrayed me. Exhausted from the intense meeting, Jamal carelessly left his encrypted laptop sitting on the kitchen island while he took a quick shower. Stella, ever paranoid and deeply insecure about her own toxic marriage, noticed the blinking light of the unfamiliar security software running on the screen. She tried to open the browser, but a complex password prompt immediately locked her out. Her mind instantly jumped to the most dramatic, ridiculous conclusion possible. When Jamal stepped out of the bathroom, Stella was waiting for him, furious and screaming at the top of her lungs. She violently threw a decorative vase against the wall, accusing him of maintaining a secret life, hiding a secret encrypted computer to talk to another woman. Jamal scrambled to calm her down, desperately trying to snatch the laptop away, which only fueled her insane jealousy. Seeking validation and wanting to complain about her husband's suspicious behavior, Stella immediately grabbed her phone and called Harrison. Harrison was pacing in his dark office, completely stressed from his illegal transfer when his phone rang. Stella hysterically vented about Jamal hiding a heavily encrypted laptop and acting incredibly shady about the firm's finances. The blood instantly drained from Harrison's face. He knew exactly what an auditor with a secret encrypted computer meant. The very next morning, Jamal walked into the venture capital firm ready to play his part. But before he could even sit down at his desk, two massive corporate security guards flanked him. Harrison emerged from his glass office, his face twisted in desperate rage. He loudly declared in front of the entire staff that Jamal was being terminated immediately for breach of corporate confidentiality. Harrison demanded the immediate surrender of all company hardware and ordered the guards to physically escort Jamal out of the building. Harrison believed he had successfully silenced the only person who knew about the embezzlement. He thought he had severed the final threat to his stolen empire. He had no idea that firing Jamal only accelerated his own brutal demise, as our inside man was now entirely free to help us orchestrate the final crushing blow. Harrison stood in the center of the open floor plan, his face flushed red with manic rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Jamal, loudly demanding that the two massive corporate security guards immediately remove the auditor from the premises. But before the heavy hands of the guards could even touch his shoulders, Jamal calmly raised his palm. He did not flinch. He did not cower. He simply reached into his tailored coat, unclipped his corporate access badge, and tossed it casually onto a nearby desk. "You cannot fire me, Harrison," Jamal said, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent, stunned office. "Because I quit. And you should really be less concerned with my security clearance and much more concerned with the anonymous creditor currently investigating your sudden escrow discrepancies." Harrison froze completely. The angry color drained instantly from his cheeks, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His jaw went slack. The junior partners staring at them began whispering frantically among themselves. Jamal did not wait for a response. He turned his back on the crumbling venture capitalist and walked out the glass doors under his own power. He left Harrison standing there, completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization that his massive corporate embezzlement was already unraveling. While Harrison was hyperventilating in his failing office, I was sitting across from Veronica in her immaculate glass conference room. The heavy oak table between us was covered in thick, legally binding documents. Harrison thought his desperate illegal transfer of $500,000 had satisfied the margin call. He was tragically mistaken. Because my shell companies secretly owned the secondary debt connected to those escrow accounts, the transfer immediately flagged as a fraudulent conveyance in our proprietary banking software. Veronica had simply intercepted the wire, freezing the stolen funds in a digital purgatory. Harrison had missed the critical deadline. The primary loan on my stolen suburban home was officially in catastrophic default. Veronica handed me a custom gold pen. "This is the official foreclosure execution order," she explained smoothly, pointing to the bottom line of the dense legal text. "Because the property was direct collateral for a fraudulent commercial loan, we bypass standard eviction delays. We have full authorization to seize the physical asset immediately." I stared at the paper. This was the house I had painstakingly decorated, the sanctuary where I had planned to build my future, completely stolen by a man I trusted. I signed my name with sharp, deliberate strokes. Veronica smiled her predatory smile and placed the document into a thick leather folder. She informed me that she had already contacted the county sheriff department. The official eviction and property seizure was sealed and scheduled to execute precisely at 8:00 p.m. on Saturday night. That was the exact hour Kendall had scheduled her massive exclusive engagement party. With the legal trap fully set and primed to snap shut, I needed to prepare myself for the main event. I left her office and walked straight into the most exclusive private designer boutique in the rich district. I was no longer the exhausted wet wife crying on a freezing porch. I was an untouchable corporate predator, and I needed the armor to match. I spent the next 3 hours undergoing a complete metamorphosis. The personal stylist paid handsomely from the blind trust's endless liquid capital pulled their most aggressive and powerful pieces. I finally settled on a striking tailored crimson pantsuit. The cut was sharp, modern, and absolutely unforgiving. It clung perfectly to my frame, radiating an intense, lethal energy. I paired it with sleek stiletto heels that echoed like gunshots against the marble floor of the boutique. The stylist cut my hair into a sharp, asymmetrical bob, completely erasing the soft, approachable look I had maintained for years. When I finally looked in the massive mirror, the woman staring back at me was a complete stranger. She was cold, calculating, and terrifyingly powerful. She was exactly the nightmare Harrison and Kendall deserved. I returned to my luxury hotel suite later that afternoon, feeling a dangerous thrill coursing through my veins. I poured myself a glass of expensive sparkling water and opened my sleek new laptop. Out of sheer morbid curiosity, I logged into my old personal email account. The inbox was flooded with spam and overdue notices from the life I had left behind. But sitting right at the top, flagged as a priority message, was a massive, highly produced digital invitation. It was from Kendall. She was completely drunk on her own fabricated arrogance. The email was an animated graphic showing off my former home draped in expensive floral arrangements and glowing under custom event lighting. The text read, "Join us to celebrate the union of Harrison and Kendall." At the very bottom, completely unable to help herself, she had typed a custom mocking note specifically directed at me. It read, Claire, I know you are probably busy struggling to survive, but I thought you should see how the real winners live. Feel free to stop by and admire the view from the sidewalk. I stared at the mocking text, a dark, genuine laugh escaping my lips. Kendall was so desperate to rub her stolen victory in my face that she had unknowingly handed me the ultimate VIP pass to her own destruction. She wanted me to witness her grand ascension into high society. She wanted me to stand on the sidewalk and cry while she drank champagne in my house. I moved my cursor over the glowing button at the very bottom of the animated invitation. I did not hesitate for a second. I clicked the button marked RSVP Yes. The system instantly generated a confirmation message thanking me for confirming my attendance. I closed the laptop with a sharp, satisfying snap. I was not just going to attend their extravagant little party. I was going to be the absolute center of attention, and I was going to tear their entire world down to the foundation. Saturday evening arrived with a suffocating blanket of humidity. But inside my former suburban home, the climate was artificially perfect. The quiet residential street was entirely choked with luxury vehicles. Kendall had completely transformed the modest property into a grotesque and ostentatious display of stolen wealth. The front lawn where I used to carefully tend a small flower garden was now buried under a massive heated event tent draped in sheer white silk. A dozen uniformed valet drivers sprinted back and forth across the driveway, eagerly parking imported sports cars and massive luxury SUVs. The interior of the house was completely unrecognizable. The walls I had painted a warm ivory were now covered in heavy velvet drapery. A towering pyramid of crystal champagne glasses dominated the center of the living room, reflecting the harsh glare of custom-installed club lighting. The space was absolutely packed shoulder to shoulder with the city's elite. Local tech investors in expensive casual wear mingled with powerful commercial real estate brokers and wealthy venture capitalists. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated effortlessly through the dense crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with imported caviar and highly expensive appetizers. It was a perfectly executed illusion of limitless prosperity. Every single person in the room believed they were standing in the presence of true financial titans. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the lavish party, the expensive food, and the very roof above their own heads were entirely funded by massive corporate fraud and stolen collateral. Near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the newly landscaped backyard, Harrison stood on a small elevated wooden platform. He was holding a microphone, tapping it gently to demand the attention of his wealthy guests. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that cost more than his junior partners earned in a month. His face was flushed with expensive alcohol and raw, unchecked arrogance. As the gentle ambient music faded out, he raised his champagne flute high into the air. He began a long, pompous speech about his brilliant financial acumen, loudly bragging about his recent aggressive acquisitions and his absolute dominance in the venture capital sector. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who firmly believed he was entirely untouchable. He spun a ridiculous, fabricated narrative about building his empire entirely from the ground up through sheer willpower and superior intellect. The investors nodded along, completely mesmerized by his toxic charisma. Then Harrison turned his adoring gaze toward Kendall. She was standing right beside him, draped in a highly expensive, shimmering gold evening gown, the stolen diamond ring flashing brightly on her finger. Harrison leaned into the microphone and publicly declared Kendall to be his ultimate muse and absolute equal in every single endeavor. He praised her relentless ambition, claiming she was the true driving force behind his recent massive financial expansion. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause, raising their glasses to toast the golden couple. Harrison grinned widely, soaking in the absolute adoration, deeply convinced he had finally secured his permanent place at the very top of the social hierarchy. The applause was absolutely deafening, echoing through the massive living room and spilling into the foyer. But the celebration was violently interrupted. I did not bother knocking. I reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handles of the custom double doors, and shoved them open with enough force to slam them loudly against the interior walls. The sharp sound cracked through the room like a physical gunshot. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the blinding light of the foyer. I was no longer the broken, weeping woman they had left in the freezing rain. I was wearing the striking, custom-tailored crimson pantsuit, my sharp, asymmetrical bob perfectly framing my cold expression. I walked with the lethal, terrifying grace of a corporate predator. I was not alone. Flanking me on either side were two massive private security contractors hired directly by the blind trust. They wore immaculate black suits, their faces devoid of emotion, their physical presence projecting an overwhelming aura of absolute authority. I paused in the center of the entrance hall, my sleek stiletto heels clicking sharply against the imported hardwood floor. The hired DJ panicked at the sudden hostile intrusion and immediately cut the ambient background music. A heavy, suffocating silence instantly crashed down over the entire party. Over 100 wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites turned their heads simultaneously to stare at me. I kept my chin high, scanning the sea of shocked faces until my eyes finally locked onto Harrison and Kendall, who were still standing frozen on their elevated platform. The color instantly drained from Harrison's face. He dropped his microphone, which hit the platform with a loud, piercing screech of feedback, causing several wealthy guests to visibly flinch. But Kendall did not freeze. Her initial shock violently mutated into pure, unhinged rage. Her face twisted into an ugly sneer, destroying the elegant facade she had desperately maintained. She recognized me, but her arrogant mind refused to process the lethal transformation right in front of her. Kendall aggressively shoved her way off the wooden platform, her expensive gold gown snagging dangerously on a catering table. She stomped across the living room floor, her face flushed red with manic fury, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice echoing terribly in the sudden dead silence. She wildly signaled for the tuxedo-clad valets and hired event staff near the door, frantically demanding that they immediately grab the homeless, pathetic ex-wife and physically throw her off the private property. She shrieked that I was a jealous lunatic trying to ruin her night, but not a single staff member moved. My massive private security contractors simply stepped forward, crossing their arms, creating an impenetrable human wall. I did not back away. I simply stood my ground, staring at her panicked, sweating face with absolute contempt. "What the hell are you doing here, Claire?" Harrison hissed, dropping his voice into a low, vicious whisper, meant only for my ears. "This is incredibly pathetic even for you. You are completely out of your mind if you think you can just crash my engagement party and cause a scene. I am giving you exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out those doors before I call the police and have you dragged away in handcuffs for criminal trespassing." He glared at me fully, expecting the old Claire to instantly wither under his harsh aggression. He expected me to drop my gaze, burst into tears, and flee into the night. Instead, I did not even blink. I did not step back. I calmly shifted my attention away from his flushed, angry face. A terrified waiter in a crisp white tuxedo was frozen nearby, holding a silver tray loaded with crystal flutes. I reached out smoothly, picked up a glass of expensive vintage champagne, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold liquid slid down my throat, a perfect contrast to the boiling tension in the room. I ignored Harrison completely and turned my icy gaze to the sprawling crowd gathered in the living room. The music remained dead. The silence was absolute. Over 100 of the most powerful people in the city were watching us with rapt attention. I made a point to slowly scan the room, deliberately locking eyes with Harrison's biggest investors. I stared directly at the prominent venture capitalists who had funded his initial startup. I made firm, unbreakable eye contact with the wealthy politicians Kendall had relentlessly courted. I wanted every single one of them to remember exactly who was standing in absolute control of this room. I let the heavy silence stretch out, forcing Harrison to marinate in the agonizing public scrutiny. He shifted his weight nervously, the facade of the untouchable corporate titan rapidly dissolving under the collective stare of his peers. When I was entirely satisfied that I had the undivided attention of every single person in the house, I turned my attention back to Harrison. I did not whisper. I did not shout. I projected my voice with crystal clarity, ensuring the acoustics of the massive foyer carried every single syllable to the very back of the living room. "I am not here to crash your ridiculous little party, Harrison," I announced smoothly, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "And you cannot have me arrested for criminal trespassing on a property that I legally own. I am simply here to conduct a mandatory physical asset inspection prior to complete asset seizure." I took another slow sip of champagne, relishing the look of absolute confusion washing over the faces of the wealthy investors. Harrison stood frozen, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately trying to gauge the reaction of the very people he had spent months trying to impress. I lowered the crystal flute, locked my eyes directly onto his, and delivered the final crushing blow. "Your primary commercial loan is in catastrophic default." I stated clearly, my tone entirely devoid of emotion, stripping away every single layer of his fake reality. "Your massive fraudulent escrow transfers from your private investor accounts were intercepted by my holding companies this morning. You failed to meet the mandatory margin call on this property, which means this collateral is officially forfeit. You and your esteemed guests have exactly 5 minutes to vacate my premises before the authorities arrive to physically remove you. For 3 agonizing seconds, the entire room was perfectly breathlessly silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit working to cool the massive space. Then a low murmur rippled through the crowd. An older venture capitalist near the back, a man who had just praised Harrison's genius, let out a sharp, nervous laugh. The sound quickly multiplied. Within moments, the room erupted into a chorus of awkward, uncomfortable laughter. The investors and socialites were completely convinced this was a highly elaborate, bitter joke. They thought I was merely a scorned, heartbroken ex-wife throwing a desperate theatrical tantrum to ruin the most important night of his life. They clinked their glasses together, exchanging amused, condescending glances, entirely oblivious to the financial slaughter happening right in front of them. Harrison forced a stiff, unnatural smile, desperately trying to play along with the wealthy crowd, pretending my legally binding words were just the jealous ravings of a lunatic. But one person in the crowd was not laughing. Stella, my former best friend and the woman who had so eagerly helped Kendall destroy my marriage, pushed her way aggressively to the front of the crowd. She was wearing a tight designer cocktail dress she could barely afford, her face contorted with petty, vindictive anger. Ever since her husband Jamal had mysteriously quit his job that morning, her own perfect suburban life had been unraveling, and she was desperate to redirect her toxic frustration. Stella marched directly toward me, her eyes flashing with pure malice. She was holding a tall cocktail filled with dark red cranberry liquid. I saw her grip tighten on the crystal glass, her arm tensing as she prepared to throw the entire sticky drink directly into my face. She wanted to publicly humiliate me to defend her wealthy new friends and secure her place in their elite social circle. I braced myself, entirely prepared to let my massive security contractors handle her, but the violent confrontation never happened. Before Stella could even raise her arm to throw the drink, the heavy brass handles behind me clicked loudly. The massive custom double doors of the foyer violently swung open for a second time, letting a sudden blast of humid night air sweep into the frozen room. Stella froze completely in her tracks, her arms suspended awkwardly in midair, the dark red cranberry cocktail sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her crystal glass. Every single head in the massive foyer snapped away from the brewing confrontation and turned towards the sudden commotion at the entrance. Stepping out of the suffocating humidity and directly into the harsh artificial glare of the custom event lighting was Veronica. She did not merely walk through the door. She stalked into the room with the precise, calculated movements of an apex predator entering an enclosure. She was wearing an impeccably tailored black trench coat over a severe dark charcoal suit, her sharp features set in an expression of absolute terrifying boredom. Flanking her on either side were two fully uniformed officers from the county sheriff's department, their hands resting casually on their heavy utility belts. Their sudden, highly official presence instantly shattered the delicate illusion of untouchable high society elegance that Kendall had so desperately tried to cultivate for her grand debut. Veronica completely ignored the sea of shocked faces and the murmurs of confusion rippling through the wealthy crowd. Her predatory gaze locked instantly onto Harrison. She moved with ruthless efficiency, her heavy leather heels clicking sharply in time with my own sleek stilettos until she came to a complete halt right beside me. My private security contractors subtly shifted their stance to allow her into the impenetrable human wall we had formed. Veronica carried a thick, expensive leather briefcase. She snapped it open with a loud, authoritative click that echoed like a gunshot through the absolute dead silence of the living room. From the dark interior of the briefcase, she produced a heavy, thick stack of legally binding documents. The top page was emblazoned with a massive, undeniable red stamp from the state superior court. It was not a gentle warning, it was not an opening for negotiation. It was an absolute, irreversible mandate of total financial destruction. Veronica extended her arm, holding the heavy dossier directly out to Harrison. He stared at the thick stack of premium paper as if she were handing him a live explosive device. He did not move to take it. His hands were trembling visibly at his sides, his breathing shallow and rapid. Veronica offered a cold, completely humorless smile and simply dropped the massive dossier directly against his chest. Pure instinct forced his shaking hands up to catch the heavy paperwork before it could hit the polished hardwood floor. "Harrison," Veronica said, her voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence like a serrated surgical blade. "I am the lead corporate counsel for the holding entity that currently owns every single line of credit attached to your name and your fraudulent business. You have been officially served with a court-mandated foreclosure and immediate asset seizure notice. As of 8:00 p.m. this evening, this entire property, along with all physical and liquid assets within its boundaries, legally belongs to my client. Harrison scrambled to catch his breath, his eyes darting frantically down to the heavy documents in his shaking hands. He flipped aggressively past the first page, his arrogant mind desperately searching for a loophole, a clerical error, a missing signature, anything at all to prove this was just a terrifying, elaborate nightmare. But his eyes snagged violently on the second page. There, in bold, undeniable legal print, was the detailed, itemized breakdown of the aggressive debt acquisition. He saw the specific name of the anonymous corporate shell company that had relentlessly purchased his fragile bridge loans, his expensive equipment leases, and his desperate secondary financing. And right beneath that, listed plainly as the sole proprietor and absolute executive controller of the holding company, was my full legal name. The physical transformation was instantaneous and utterly pathetic to witness. The remaining shreds of his pompous, invincible bravado simply evaporated into thin air. His face, previously flushed with expensive vintage alcohol and unearned toxic confidence, turned the sickening, lifeless color of wet ash. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly like a fish pulled out of water, but absolutely no sound came out. He physically swayed on his feet, the crushing, inescapable weight of the revelation finally breaking through his thick skull. The brilliant financial genius, the untouchable venture capital titan, he suddenly realized that for the past week, he had not been brilliantly building an empire. He had been eagerly, blindly digging his own grave, and I had happily handed him the shovel. The blind trust did not just own this house. I legally owned his entire fabricated life. The nervous, awkward laughter that had previously bubbled up from the wealthy crowd died instantly. These were not stupid, gullible people. They were aggressive financial predators in their own right, highly attuned to the scent of blood in the water. The undeniable presence of the uniformed sheriff deputies and the sheer volume of the court-stamped documents immediately communicated a catastrophic reality. The wealthy investors, the very people Harrison had just spent 20 minutes aggressively lying to on his wooden platform, realized simultaneously that the entire startup was a fragile, worthless house of cards, and the wind had just violently changed direction. An older, heavily connected venture capitalist, the exact same man who had led the mocking laughter just moments ago, aggressively pushed his way through the dense crowd. He grabbed Harrison roughly by the shoulder of his expensive custom tuxedo, violently spinning him around. He began shouting at the top of his lungs, his face purple with rage, demanding to know what exactly had happened to the millions of dollars in protected escrow funds he had personally injected into the firm just last month. The word escrow acted like a spark in a room full of gasoline. Absolute unbridled chaos erupted in the massive living room. Dozens of furious investors, realizing their money had been illegally leveraged and completely lost, surged forward. They surrounded Harrison like a pack of starving, rabid wolves. Men in expensive suits began violently shoving each other, screaming brutal threats of federal lawsuits and demanding immediate wire transfers to return their stolen capital. Kendall shrieked in genuine terror, dropping her champagne flute as the beautifully staged engagement party violently dissolved into a corporate riot. A tall, aggressive tech broker grabbed a silver tray of imported caviar from a terrified waiter and hurled it furiously against the velvet-draped wall, staining the expensive fabric with a sickening smear of black oil. Waiters dropped their heavy trays in panic, the crystal champagne glasses shattering into a million sharp fragments on the floor. The harsh sound was completely drowned out by the deafening roar of angry billionaires realizing they had been scammed. Kendall, however, was violently pushed into a state of sheer panic. She could not comprehend how her perfect high society debut was disintegrating into a literal riot. Desperate to salvage her shattered social standing, she aggressively pushed her way through the mob of furious men. She snatched the discarded microphone from the floor of the wooden platform, the speaker emitting a sharp screech of feedback that forced several investors to cover their ears. Kendall climbed back onto the platform, her shimmering gold gown now stained with spilled champagne, and frantically waved her arms. She screamed into the microphone, begging the wealthy crowd to stop acting like animals. She wildly assured them that everything was a massive misunderstanding. She pointed a shaking finger at me, loudly declaring that I was just a bitter, bankrupt ex-wife trying to fabricate a scandal out of pure jealousy. To placate the furious investors surrounding her fiancé, Kendall arrogantly boasted about the firm's massive capital reserves. She confidently shrieked that Harrison's venture capital firm held millions of dollars in highly secure, untouchable escrow accounts, guaranteeing every single investment was perfectly safe. She foolishly believed her loud lies would immediately sedate the panicked crowd. But her shrill reassurances were instantly obliterated by a calm, authoritative voice echoing from the back of the chaotic living room. Jamal stepped out from the shadows of the velvet-draped hallway. He was no longer wearing the exhausted expression of a captive corporate auditor. He walked with the relaxed posture of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The moment the investors recognized the lead independent auditor for Harrison's firm, a sudden tense hush fell over the riotous crowd. The billionaires turned their furious attention toward Jamal, desperate for concrete answers. Jamal stopped a few feet away from the wooden platform, looking directly up at Kendall's flushed, panicked face. He crossed his arms casually over his chest and delivered the absolute kill shot to Harrison's entire fabricated empire. "There are no millions in those escrow accounts," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with absolute clarity through the tense silence. "Those accounts are completely empty. The money is gone." The crowd gasped collectively. Kendall lowered the microphone, her jaw dropping open in sheer disbelief. Harrison violently lunged forward, his face purple with rage, screaming at Jamal to shut his mouth, threatening to destroy him for violating corporate confidentiality. But Jamal did not even flinch. He turned his gaze away from Kendall and looked directly into the furious eyes of the lead venture capitalist who had funded the firm. "As the lead auditor on record, I reviewed the master banking logs this morning." Jamal continued, his tone methodical and legally precise. "Yesterday afternoon, to cover a catastrophic margin call triggered by massive secondary debt, Harrison initiated a direct, unauthorized transfer. He illegally drained $500,000 directly from your protected investor escrow accounts. He moved your money into his primary operational liquidity pool to save his own skin. He committed federal corporate embezzlement." Jamal pointed a steady finger directly at the massive diamond ring sparkling on Kendall's left hand, then gestured broadly to the extravagant floral arrangements and the crystal champagne towers scattered across the ruined living room. "And he did not just use your money to cover his bad loans," Jamal added, twisting the knife with brutal efficiency. "The massive deposit for this ostentatious party, the custom luxury car leases, and that massive diamond sitting on his fiancée's finger were all financed by leveraging your stolen capital. You unwittingly funded his personal spending spree." The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The wealthy investors' men who prided themselves on their cutthroat financial instincts realized they had been played for absolute fools by a desperate con artist. Their initial panic instantly morphed into a dark, violent, and predatory rage. Kendall stood frozen on the wooden platform, the microphone slipping from her sweaty grasp and clattering loudly onto the floor. She slowly turned her head to look at Harrison, the man she had relentlessly pursued, the man she believed was her golden ticket to the absolute highest tier of the social elite currently cowering behind a toppled catering table. He was sweating profusely, unable to look her in the eye. The horrifying reality finally pierced through Kendall's thick layer of delusion. He was not a billionaire titan. He was a broke, desperate fraud who was about to be sent to federal prison. A visceral, guttural scream ripped from Kendall's throat. Her face twisted into a mask of pure horror and furious betrayal. She violently grabbed her own left hand and aggressively yanked the massive diamond ring off her finger, scratching her knuckle in the frantic process. She cocked her arm back and hurled the heavy piece of jewelry directly at Harrison's chest with all of her strength. It struck his expensive tuxedo jacket and bounced uselessly onto the hardwood floor. "You lied to me!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. "You told me you were rich. You told me you were better than her. You are a complete fraud, and you ruined my life." She did not wait for a response. Kendall gathered the heavy silk fabric of her ruined gold gown and violently shoved her way through the crowd of stunned investors. She sprinted toward the side entrance of the house, desperate to flee the impending federal disaster she had just proudly attached her name to. Harrison watched her run, his final fragile connection to his fabricated reality completely severed. He was entirely alone, trapped in a house he no longer owned, surrounded by furious billionaires demanding their stolen money. The lead venture capitalist cracked his knuckles loudly, threatening to beat the stolen funds out of Harrison right then and there. Pure animalistic cowardice seized Harrison's entire body as the investors closed in. He scrambled backward across the ruined floor, desperately kicking aside broken crystal champagne glasses and crushed imported caviar. He decided to abandon everything, completely forgetting the woman he claimed to love and the empire he pretended to build. He turned his back on the furious mob and sprinted wildly toward the glass sliding doors leading to the dark backyard, hoping to escape into the suburban night. But just as his hand clamped down on the handle of the back door, a new terrifying sound stopped him dead in his tracks. A series of heavy, authoritative knocks echoed violently from the massive front double doors of the foyer. The sound was not the polite tapping of a late party guest. It was the loud, aggressive, undeniable pounding of federal law enforcement executing an immediate arrest warrant. Before Harrison could turn the handle of the sliding glass door, the massive double doors in the foyer violently burst open. The heavy brass hinges groaned as a dozen armed agents stormed into the lavishly decorated living room. These agents were dressed in tactical windbreakers, the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation emblazoned across their backs. They were an elite strike team from the white-collar crime division, moving with terrifying precision. They instantly secured all exits, completely blocking the furious mob of wealthy investors from leaving the ruined engagement party. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a deeply serious expression, stepped directly into the center of the chaotic room. He held up a polished silver badge, the harsh event lighting catching the metal and reflecting a blinding flash across the velvet-draped walls. He did not ask for permission to enter, ignoring the shattered champagne glasses crunching beneath his tactical boots. His piercing gaze scanned the terrified crowd, instantly cutting through the lingering chaos. It took him 3 seconds to locate his primary target. Harrison was still frozen near the patio exit, his hand clutching the glass door handle, his face drained of color. The lead agent locked eyes with the terrified venture capitalist and began marching purposefully across the living room, flanked heavily by 2 armed tactical officers. The furious billionaires and angry tech investors instantly parted, eagerly clearing a wide path for the federal authorities. Harrison pressed his back flat against the cold glass of the sliding door, his tuxedo soaked in nervous sweat. He looked absolutely pathetic, a cornered animal realizing there was nowhere left to run. The lead agent stopped 2 feet away from him, commanding absolute authority. He unclipped a stack of legal documents from his belt and held them up. "Harrison," the agent stated, his voice booming effortlessly over the nervous murmurs of the stunned crowd, "you are being placed under immediate federal arrest." The agent did not lower his voice to spare the man any public humiliation. He wanted every single investor in that room to hear exactly how their money had been stolen. "You are being charged with aggravated identity theft, severe bank fraud, and massive corporate embezzlement crossing state lines," the agent declared with absolute clarity. "We have secured undeniable digital proof that you willfully forged signatures on federally insured loan documents, illegally leveraged residential collateral, and purposefully drained millions of dollars from protected investor escrow accounts to fund your operations." Harrison shook his head frantically, his breathing shallow and rapid. He desperately raised his hands in front of his chest, stammering out a pathetic defense. He wildly claimed there was a massive misunderstanding, blaming his junior partners for the sudden financial discrepancies. He shrieked that he was a highly respected venture capitalist convinced his fabricated social standing would somehow protect him from federal prosecution. The lead agent stared at him with professional disgust. He had heard the exact cowardly excuses from desperate con artists before and had zero patience for the arrogant display. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead agent continued, completely ignoring Harrison and his pathetic lies. "I highly suggest you start using it immediately before you incriminate yourself any further." The agent gave a sharp nod to the 2 tactical officers standing on either side of him. They moved with lightning speed. Before Harrison could even take another terrified breath, the officers lunged forward. They grabbed him violently by the shoulders of his custom-tailored tuxedo, spinning him around with brutal force. They slammed him face first directly into the velvet-draped wall of the living room he had just proudly claimed to own. The heavy impact rattled the expensive framed artwork hanging nearby. Harrison let out a loud yelp of pain as his cheek was smashed painfully against the heavy fabric. One officer aggressively wrenched Harrison's arms forcefully behind his back, easily overpowering the terrified fraud. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed violently through the massive, dead-silent room. It was the absolute final nail in his coffin. The wealthy investors, the powerful politicians, and the local elite stood perfectly still, watching in stunned, satisfied silence as the man who had just arrogantly toasted to his own financial genius was publicly subdued like a common criminal. I stood in the foyer alongside Veronica, watching the entire spectacle unfold with a deep sense of cold satisfaction. The agonizing humiliation he had forced upon me was finally being returned to him entirely. The financial guillotine had firmly dropped. But while the wealthy investors felt a wave of vindicated relief, one person in the room lost their mind. Stella, who had been hiding near the overturned catering tables, suddenly burst through the crowd. She was hysterical, her face heavily streaked with ruined makeup, her cocktail dress stained with spilled alcohol. The sight of federal agents slamming a venture capitalist into the wall completely shattered her fragile social climbing reality. If Harrison was truly a criminal, it meant Kendall was bankrupt, which meant her desperate attempts to infiltrate this elite circle were destroyed. Stella began shrieking at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice piercing the tense silence. She wildly threw herself towards the officers, frantically begging them to stop screaming that Harrison was an important man who did not deserve this. The agents easily blocked her advance, sternly ordering her to step back or face arrest. Terrified by the threat of prison, Stella spun around and searched the dense crowd until she found her husband. Jamal was standing quietly nearby, watching the arrest with absolute cold indifference. Stella charged at him, grabbing his suit jacket and shaking him violently. She demanded he use his accounting credentials to explain the missing money, begging him to commit a felony to save a man who ruined my life entirely, unaware that Jamal was the exact person who enthusiastically handed the federal authorities the loaded gun. Jamal did not flinch as his wife aggressively shook his expensive suit jacket. He simply stood perfectly still in the center of the chaotic living room, letting her hysterical, shrill demands wash over him. Stella was completely unhinged, screaming at him to use his professional influence to somehow magically erase federal embezzlement charges, desperate to salvage her pathetic illusion of high society inclusion. Slowly, Jamal raised his hands and firmly detached her frantic clawing fingers from his lapels. He did not yell. He did not match her desperate energy. He simply looked down at the woman he had been married to for 5 years with an expression of absolute terrifying disgust. The profound disappointment in his eyes was heavier than any screamed insult could ever be. He reached smoothly into the breast pocket of his coat and withdrew a thick, sealed manila envelope. Without a single word, he pressed the heavy package firmly against her chest, forcing her to instinctively take it. Stella stared down at the brown paper, her mascara running in thick black streaks down her flushed cheeks, completely confused by the gesture. She fumbled with the metal clasp, tearing the envelope open with shaking hands. Her eyes frantically scanned the thick legal documents inside the bold black letters, declaring an immediate uncontested filing for divorce. All of the meticulously gathered evidence of her toxic infidelity, her relentless emotional abuse, and her secret financial betrayals were completely documented within those pages. Jamal did not give her a chance to speak. He turned his back on her horrified gasp, smoothly adjusted his tie, and walked purposefully out the massive front doors, stepping out into the cool night air as a completely free man. Behind him, the reality of her total isolation finally struck. Stella let out a hollow, agonizing wail, her knees buckling completely. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably amidst the shattered champagne glass and crushed caviar, entirely abandoned by the social circle she had sacrificed her actual marriage to join. While Stella was publicly disintegrating, Kendall saw a brief window of opportunity. The massive foyer was entirely congested with federal agents aggressively processing Harrison, and the wealthy investors were completely distracted by the sheer spectacle of his downfall. Kendall silently discarded her ruined designer heels, gripping the heavy gold silk of her torn gown to prevent it from rustling. She pressed her back against the velvet-draped wall, attempting to slink quietly toward the side exit leading to the catering kitchen. Her tear-streaked face was hastily arranged into a mask of total absolute victimhood. She was entirely prepared to play the role of the innocent, naive girlfriend who had been cruelly manipulated by a financial predator, perfectly ready to throw Harrison directly under the federal bus to save her own skin. She had almost reached the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen when a heavy tactical boot suddenly blocked her path. Kendall gasped, looking up into the stern face of a female federal agent. Kendall immediately burst into loud theatrical tears, clasping her hands together in front of her chest. She began babbling frantically, claiming she had absolutely no idea what Harrison was doing with the venture capital firm. She loudly insisted she was just a helpless bystander, begging the officer to let her go home so she could recover from this terrible, traumatic ordeal. The female agent did not even blink at the dramatic performance. She pulled a folded legal document from her utility vest and opened it deliberately. The agent firmly informed Kendall that she was not leaving the premises tonight. The agent pointed a gloved finger at the bottom of a fraudulent commercial lease agreement, the exact lease that had illegally secured the multi-million-dollar loan for this heavily mortgaged house. Right there, signed in elegant sweeping ink, was Kendall's full legal name as the primary financial co-guarantor. By desperately trying to forcefully insert herself into his fabricated wealth, Kendall had legally bound herself to his massive federal crimes. the color completely drained from Kendall's face as the officer firmly grabbed her arm, officially detaining her for immediate federal questioning regarding the stolen escrow funds. Across the ruined room, the lead agent firmly grabbed Harrison by his collar, violently hauling the ruined venture capitalist up from the floor. Harrison was trembling violently, his custom tuxedo wrinkled and smeared with dust from the wall, his wrists bound tightly in heavy steel handcuffs. The tactical officers began forcibly marching him across the massive foyer, navigating through the angry crowd of investors who were eagerly shouting insults at him. Their path led directly past the spot where I was standing perfectly still beside Veronica. As Harrison was dragged violently toward the open front doors, his frantic, bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. The absolute crushing realization that I had orchestrated every single detail of this perfect destruction finally broke whatever tiny shred of arrogance he had left. He did not try to stand tall. He did not try to salvage his pride. The invincible corporate titan instantly collapsed. Harrison suddenly went completely limp, dropping violently to his knees right in front of me, forcing the two federal agents to halt their march. He looked up at me, tears streaming rapidly down his bruised cheek, his face contorted in an expression of pure pathetic desperation. He began openly weeping, ignoring the harsh glares of the billionaires watching him beg. He sobbed uncontrollably, hysterically, pleading with me to tell the federal agents that this was all just a massive marital misunderstanding. He begged me to call off the holding companies to release the frozen escrow accounts, frantically promising he would give me anything I wanted if I just saved him from federal prison. I stood completely motionless, looking down at the broken, weeping man kneeling in the ruins of the life he had stolen from me. I felt absolutely zero pity. There was no sadness, no lingering attachment, and no mercy in my heart. He had ruthlessly stripped away my entire life to fund his pathetic ego, laughing while I suffered. I slowly lowered my gaze to meet his terrified, desperate eyes. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with absolute terrifying finality, ensuring every single person in that room heard my judgment. "You threw me out into the rain without a single cent," I stated coldly, my voice cutting through his pathetic sobbing. "Enjoy the climate-controlled cell." The agents yanked Harrison up from his knees, his agonizing sobs echoing off the vaulted ceilings as they dragged him roughly out the massive front doors. The moment the federal authorities cleared the threshold with their primary target, the paralyzing spell holding the wealthy crowd instantly shattered into a million pieces. Pure, unadulterated self-preservation violently kicked in. The powerful venture capitalists, local politicians, and elite socialites had absolutely zero intention of being caught anywhere near an active federal crime scene. A chaotic, desperate stampede toward the exits immediately began. Men in expensive custom tuxedos forcefully shoved past terrified waiters, abandoning their stolen caviar and vintage champagne without a single second's thought. Women in designer gowns hiked up their expensive silk skirts, sprinting across the ruined hardwood floors in a frantic bid to reach their luxury vehicles before the police established a secure perimeter. The massive front doors were thrown wide open, revealing a blinding sea of flashing red and blue emergency lights illuminating the dark suburban street. The frantic exodus was a pathetic display of upper-class cowardice. Within mere minutes, the sprawling, crowded living room was entirely abandoned. The deafening roar of angry billionaires was completely replaced by a heavy, echoing silence. The extravagant floral arrangements towering crystal champagne pyramids and the absurd wooden speaking platform now stood in stark, deeply ironic contrast to the harsh reality of the massive federal raid. The ultimate symbol of Harrison's fabricated wealth was now nothing more than a heavily documented crime scene stripped of all its fake glamour. I stood perfectly still amidst the wreckage, watching the final few panicked guests scramble down the expansive driveway like frightened rats fleeing a sinking ship. Veronica stepped up beside me, her heavy leather briefcase securely fastened, and her posture perfect. She smoothly pulled out her encrypted smartphone and tapped the screen twice. Less than 60 seconds later, a highly specialized bonded locksmith stepped through the open front doors. He was a stocky, silent man carrying a heavy steel toolbox, entirely unfazed by the shattered glass and ruined luxury surrounding him. Veronica directed him straight to the primary control panel hidden behind the velvet-draped wall. The locksmith worked with ruthless mechanical efficiency. He completely bypassed the expensive security system Harrison had proudly installed to keep me out. He aggressively dismantled the smart locks on every single exterior door, stripping away Harrison's digital access codes and replacing them with high-grade military encrypted hardware. He rewired the entire network in absolute silence, completely severing the house from its former fraudulent owner. The final step was the most satisfying moment of the night. The locksmith activated the new biometric scanner mounted directly beside the heavy brass handles of the front door. I stepped forward, pressing my right thumb firmly against the glowing glass sensor. The machine beeped loudly, flashing a brilliant green light that confirmed my unique biological signature. The heavy deadbolt slid into place with a resounding metallic thud that echoed like a vault ceiling shut. The property no longer belonged to a fabricated venture capital firm. It legally, physically, and digitally recognized me as its absolute, undisputed master. As the heavy front doors were secured, I noticed a solitary, pathetic figure being forcibly escorted down the long, sweeping driveway by a uniformed officer, Stella. She was no longer screaming. The hysterical, violent energy that had fueled her toxic social climbing had completely burned out, leaving nothing but an empty, ruined shell of a woman. Her expensive designer cocktail dress was hopelessly stained with spilled alcohol, and she was clutching the heavy manila envelope containing her divorce papers against her chest, like a physical shield. The officer guided her firmly toward the edge of the property line, officially removing her from the premises she had so desperately tried to claim as her own. Just before she stepped onto the public sidewalk to face the flashing cameras of the arriving local news crew, Stella stopped. She slowly turned her head, her ruined makeup catching the harsh glare of the flashing police lights. She looked back up at the massive illuminated house, her eyes eventually locking directly onto mine through the large front windows. There was no anger left in her gaze. There was no arrogant superiority. There was only the crushing, absolute realization of her own terrible choices. She had brutally betrayed her best friend, destroyed her own marriage, and eagerly participated in a massive federal fraud, all for a temporary taste of a fabricated, worthless elite lifestyle. Now she had absolutely nothing. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply stared back at her with the cold, detached indifference of a woman looking at a total stranger. The officer tugged her arm, and Stella finally turned away, disappearing into the dark, chaotic night. I turned away from the massive front windows, leaving the flashing police lights behind me. The federal agents had entirely cleared the property, leaving me absolutely alone with Veronica and my private security contractors. I began to walk slowly through the sprawling, silent house. My sleek stilettos clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floors, the sound echoing endlessly through the massive empty rooms. I walked past the shattered crystal champagne glasses, the smeared imported caviar, and the ruined velvet drapes. I walked through the extravagant formal dining room, the massive chef's kitchen, and the sprawling master suite that Harrison had so proudly tried to claim as his own. The deep, agonizing trauma of the past year, the endless nights of crying in a tiny, cramped apartment, the crushing humiliation of being publicly discarded, it was all completely gone. The heavy, suffocating pain had evaporated, entirely replaced by the cold, deeply satisfying weight of absolute control and reclaimed territory. I had not merely survived his brutal betrayal. I had meticulously weaponized it. I had patiently stalked him through the shadows of the financial markets, systematically dismantling every single piece of his fabricated life. I ran my hands slowly along the smooth marble countertop of the kitchen island, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of my total victory. The game was finally over, and I was the only player left standing on the board. 6 months can completely rewrite the fundamental architecture of a human life. It was a crisp, clear Tuesday morning in late November, the kind of biting cold that signaled the absolute end of the vibrant autumn season across the United States. Far away from the luxurious, climate-controlled skyscrapers of the financial district, Harrison was waking up in a drastically different environment. He was currently serving the first few months of a mandatory 25-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The aggressive financial empire he had so violently tried to build had been utterly dismantled by the federal government. His highly publicized trial had been a total media circus, exposing every single fraudulent transfer, every forged document, and every stolen dollar from his desperate investors. There were no expensive, custom-tailored tuxedos in his new reality, only the harsh, abrasive fabric of standard-issue prison uniforms. He spent his days scrubbing industrial cafeteria floors, completely stripped of his arrogant superiority, forced to submit to the absolute authority of the prison guards. The powerful venture capitalist who had once ruthlessly mocked my financial insecurity was now entirely dependent on the state for his next meal, his name reduced to a mere cautionary tale whispered among terrified corporate executives. Kendall did not fare much better in the brutal aftermath of the federal raid. the massive criminal investigation quickly swept her up in its destructive wake. Her desperate attempt to play the innocent, naive girlfriend violently backfired when federal prosecutors produced the fraudulent commercial lease agreements bearing her verified signature. While she managed to narrowly avoid federal prison time by fully cooperating with the authorities and testifying against Harrison, her precious high society life was completely annihilated. The State Real Estate Commission permanently revoked her broker license due to her active participation in severe financial fraud, with her primary source of income destroyed and her reputation utterly toxic. Kendall was forced into total humiliating bankruptcy. She was violently evicted from her luxury downtown apartment, her expensive designer wardrobe liquidated to pay off her mounting legal debts. The elite social circles she had so ruthlessly clawed her way into completely abandoned her, treating her name like a contagious disease. She was last seen working as a basic administrative assistant in a small rundown strip mall on the outskirts of the city, permanently exiled from the glamorous modern American lifestyle she had sacrificed everything to achieve. I did not waste a single second gloating over their pathetic destruction. I was entirely too busy building an empire. I sat at the head of the massive, polished mahogany table in the primary executive boardroom of my father's holding company. The room was a fortress of glass and steel suspended 50 stories above the bustling downtown streets. The air was thick with focused predatory energy. I had officially dissolved the blind trust and assumed total public executive control of the $80 million portfolio. But I did not simply want to maintain the massive wealth my family had accumulated. The brutal, agonizing betrayal I had survived completely rewired my understanding of the corporate landscape. I had permanently pivoted the firm's primary investment strategy. We no longer passively invested in standard tech startups or standard commercial real estate. I transformed the holding company into a highly aggressive, specialized financial predator. We actively hunted down predatory lenders, corrupt venture capitalists, and arrogant corporate fraudsters who believed they were untouchable. We weaponized massive capital to trigger catastrophic margin calls, forcibly liquidating toxic firms and returning stolen assets to vulnerable investors. I had taken the exact same ruthless financial tactics I used to destroy Harrison and scaled them into a highly profitable, entirely legal corporate execution machine. Sitting directly across from me at the massive boardroom table was Jamal. He was no longer the exhausted, terrified independent auditor desperately trying to appease a corrupt boss. He wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit, his posture radiating calm, absolute confidence. After finalizing his divorce and legally severing all ties with Stella, I had immediately hired him as my new chief financial officer. His intimate knowledge of corporate loopholes and his uncompromising ethical standards made him the perfect financial architect for my new empire. Jamal smoothly slid a thick, heavily detailed financial dossier across the polished wood. We had just closed out the third fiscal quarter, and the results were absolutely staggering. Under our combined aggressive strategy, the holding company had successfully acquired and liquidated 3 major corrupt lending firms, generating a massive, unprecedented return on investment. We reviewed the dense numerical data in complete synchronized harmony, our professional partnership forged in the absolute fire of Harrison's destruction. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, and absolutely no weakness in our current operational model. We were an unstoppable force in the modern financial sector, completely rewriting the rules of the game to favor genuine accountability. The intense executive meeting concluded, and Jamal quietly exited the massive boardroom to execute the new financial directives. I was left entirely alone in the sprawling, silent space. I slowly pushed my leather executive chair back and stood up. My sleek, custom-tailored charcoal suit moved perfectly with me as I walked deliberately toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that dominated the southern wall. I pressed my hand flat against the cold, thick glass and looked out over the sprawling American skyline. The city stretched out before me, a massive grid of concrete steel and endless opportunity glittering under the bright morning sun. Thousands of cars moved like tiny metallic insects far below, completely unaware of the massive financial power I wielded from this silent room. I thought back to that desperate, terrifying night a year ago, standing in the freezing rain outside my former home, shivering in cheap clothes with absolutely nothing to my name. I remembered the blinding tears, the crushing humiliation, and the suffocating belief that my life was entirely over. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the immense, undeniable strength radiating through my entire body. I was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. I was no longer a heartbroken wife crying over a pathetic, fraudulent man. I was a self-made titan. I had taken the ultimate devastating betrayal and meticulously forged it into an unbreakable, towering empire, and I was just getting started.